please join me in welcoming Hillary Rodham Clinton and Lissa Muscatine.
Thank you so much. Well, that was very nice. It is great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks to you and Brad for running such a great bookstore.
Thank you.
Politics and Prose.
Thank you. Well, speaking of books, you've had it out for 4 days now.
That's right.
4, I guess.
That's
Tuesday, right? Tuesday. You probably lost count because it's been one of these paces that was more like when you were secretary.
Exactly.
You've started your book tour. You're traveling all over the place. You're doing all these interviews. You're keeping a pretty frenetic pace. But I have to ask you, because from the first time I've read this book, and I've read it several times now, I was struck by a kind of lightheartedness in it. It's a serious book. It deals with obviously very serious issues. But there's a lighter side that comes through. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, as I've watched you just in these first 4 days, and you've had some tough interviews, you seem like you're having a really good time.
Well, Lissa, I am having a good time. And I think that's in part due to the enthusiasm that I have experienced as I've traveled around in these last couple of days. It's a great feeling to have written a book about 4 years that were consequential in my view, and we can talk about that more, but which for me were both a personal journey and a very heavy responsibility. And what I tried to do in the book was to write it so that I could give you, the readers, a bit of a peek behind the curtain, because the headlines certainly tell some of the story, but not all of the story. And it's more difficult to even get information about the so-called trend line. I wanted to combine both. And the hardest part for me about writing this book was that it was, believe it or not, 3 times longer when I first finished it. I wanted to put every funny story, every bizarre meal, I mean, whatever I could remember and wanted to share. And the publisher did say, you've got to cut 2/3 of this book. And so I worked hard to keep the combination of seriousness, because obviously there's a lot of that, but also the human side, not just me, but what I saw and learned as I traveled around the world.
You've never been shy about your opinions, but it does seem to me that you're pretty free to speak your mind these days.
I think that's true from some of the reactions that I've had the last few days. And I say in the book that maybe it's just the wonderful wealth of experience that I've now had. Maybe it's because I am totally done with, being really careful about what to say because somebody might think this instead of that. It just gets too exhausting and frustrating. And it just seems a whole lot easier to just put it out there and hope people get used to it, whether you agree with it or not, to know exactly where I'm coming from, what I think, what I feel. I really believe that's missing in both our government dialogue, and of course many of you probably are somehow associated in some way with our government, and certainly in our political dialogue. There are so many big issues, and I talk about some of them both internationally and nationally, and I don't think we gain by either shouting matches or finger pointing or biting one's tongue. I think we really need to have a very open, straightforward conversation, and maybe I'm trying to model that, I don't know, but that's how it feels to me, and it feels a little bit liberating, to be honest.
And it's great to watch, I have to say. It's nice to see.
You know, there are occasions when I think people gulp a little, but
okay.
including myself, to be fair. But I really want to share the experiences that I've had. I mean, I came to this job, as I write in the book, in quite an unusual way, and I was incredibly surprised when the president asked me to serve, and slightly less surprised when I finally agreed to. And then it was just from the very first moment a mad dash, because we inherited a pretty serious agenda of problems and challenges. So the perspective that I've gained, I think, has encouraged me even more to speak my mind and contribute what I can to whatever debate's occurring.
Let's talk about actually the process of writing the book before we get to the substance of it, because I remember from the last book you had a day job.
I did.
You were in the Senate, and this is really true, honest goodness truth, because I was working with you on that book. You did a lot of the work on that book between about midnight and 3 a.m., and I remember having routine meetings with you around your dining room table at 3 a.m.
Right.
We did that for a few months to get it finished. This time you carved out more time to really, really focus on it, and I think it's interesting. You had a great team working for you, but you are not somebody who has ever taken a draft, be it of a book, a speech, a chapter, and just said, oh, great, this looks good, let's put it between a cover or publish it right now, it's fine. You've always kind of slaved over your writing. You write, you rewrite. You still write in longhand on a legal pad.
I do.
And anybody who's ever been with somebody who's writing a book knows that it's a little bit like watching someone go through labor. It's an incredibly painful process, but there's great joy at the end. And sort of on the scale of pain and joy, what was the process of writing this book like for you?
Well, I should preface what I say by making clear that Lissa has been my partner in some of the most important writing and speaking that I've done, going back to the White House years when she was a speechwriter at the White House. And as I point out in the chapter called Unfinished Business, about both women's rights and LGBT rights and other human rights, Lissa was my partner in the women's speech in Beijing. Fast forward, she was also my partner in the Living History autobiography, and what she is describing is absolutely true, and it was incredibly stressful because I did have this day job that I loved, but I had said and signed a contract, so I was obligated to produce a book. So I would come home, and Lissa, despite all of her many responsibilities, including her wonderful family, would be around that dining room table with me as we struggled over the chapters in Living History. This was different in that I left the State Department. I had, for the first time in many years, much more freedom and control over my own schedule. I have a little third-floor attic study in the old farmhouse that we live in New York, and I would go up there early in the morning, and I would make as many detours as I possibly could. It was always time for something else. It was time to walk the dogs. It was time to go down and get more water, because you have to be really well hydrated when you try to ride. I just came up with a million reasons. Oh, and then, of course, I read that you really should not sit for more than an hour. So that became my favorite excuse. But it was a great experience, despite how difficult it was. And it was difficult because there was a mass of material that we were trying to condense. It was also hard to relive some of what happened, and also to make sense in retrospect about what had occurred. I had a great team of researchers and advisors and people who would take my scribbly handwriting and translate it and come back with suggestions. It was a terrific process in that way. But even though I had more free time to do it, I found it equally intense because it's something that once you start writing a book and you're putting yourself into it, and in my case, I had sort of an idea that there might be some people who would read every word looking for something I said that might not be entirely 1,000% true or accurate. So it was painful, and I had a great backup with the researchers who helped me. So I enjoyed it, but if I were to to put it on a scale, some days were off the charts wonderful, and some days were not even on the charts terrible, because it was hard to write. And then, of course, I wanted to make sure that it was a fair reflection of what I experienced and what I learned, and I had to, at some point, let it go and hold my breath, and I'm pleased with the way it came out.
Well, and the reviews have been really good.
Much to my amazement,
it's
in
a
some
hard,
respects.
Well, it's a hard book to write, to take
well,
4 years of your life, and it does involve public policy, and you may or may not be done with your public life, and there are a lot of constraints, but,
well, I have
a
to
lot
say,
comes through.
When I finally got the near complete manuscript, I did impose upon Lissa, because she's a great reader as well as a great writer, and I did hold my breath that entire weekend, because she has never minced words. She will come and say, I don't think this works, or that's not what you mean to say, or this really could be restructured, kind of gently but clearly critical. And she came back, and she had some very good suggestions, but she also had some very positive, reinforcing reactions. And I have to say, that helped me breathe a little better. I was not sleeping much toward the end, because I was so worried that somehow I may have totally missed the point of what I was trying to communicate. And it's an odd combination of personal, and particularly in the beginning, when I talk about the creation of this team of rivals with the president, and then pretty wonky and dense. And there were some chapters that I felt compelled to include, like a chapter about the economic challenges we face abroad and how that affects us here at home, and what it means to be competing, if you're an American business or an American worker, against state capitalism. And I know that some eyes in the editing process and the publishers kind of rolled a little bit, like, you really, I said, yeah, I really need to talk about that, because one of my primary jobs when I became secretary, given where we were economically, was to try to help with the work the president and the Secretary of Treasury and others were doing to restore confidence in our economy, as well as in our political and foreign policy agenda. So it was a complicated book.
Well, you're nice to have let me read it toward the end. And I have to say, and this was the honest goodness truth, I loved it from the first read. And obviously any manuscript can be improved on, but I think I liked it a lot because it isn't really that wonky. It may have seemed like there are some denser portions, but you all have to read it. It's fascinating, it's entertaining. It's a terrific book, and as I said earlier, I think you really come through it in a way that maybe not as much in some of the earlier books, as an earlier time of your life, an earlier time of your career, and I think you said you feel more liberated now.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through. But we do and should talk about the substance, and you said a minute ago that when you assumed the secretaryship, you and President Obama came into a raft of problems. Clearly there was a perception, not only in this country but around the world, that our role and our influence was diminishing. Our economy was sputtering at best. Some of our key alliances were fraying or frayed. Iran was making no bones about its interest in acquiring or building a nuclear weapon. China was on the rise, and then you have the ongoing challenges of climate change and poverty and human rights. And so I'm wondering if being Secretary of State isn't somewhat of an exercise in triage.
That's an interesting way to put it, Lissa, because I think it's a multi-leveled job all at the same time. There are the crises that require immediate attention, and yes, the intensive care unit. I mean, you have to put everybody together, both physically or virtually. You have to be building those alliances and tending to those partnerships in the midst of a crisis in order to deal with the crisis. But then there are the emergencies, but not as serious as the ones in the intensive care unit. You've got a big, if you continue with this metaphor, a big emergency room with all kinds of injuries. People who are there representing countries, representing individuals, non-state actors and the like, all of whom need tending. They're not going away. They're expecting the United States to show up and to make a move. however we define that. And then, of course, there are the longer-term chronic problems, the wards filled with people who are struggling. I saw my role primarily to do all I could to help restore American leadership. And that meant several things to me. It certainly meant that I had to figure out how to deal with the emergencies and how to tend to what were a broad array of complaints about our country from the prior 8 years. It was not just Iraq. It was not just the war on terror and the abuses that came to light. It was not just the economic collapse, although that's a trifecta that was waiting on our doorstep. It was the feeling that somehow America had violated our own values, the rules that we had helped to construct and pushed for compliance in how countries were supposed to be behaving, whether it was conventions that we had signed against torture, or it was anti-ballistic missile treaties, or whatever it might be. And that there was a sense of absence in some parts of the world. That was the message that came through to me when I began making a series of phone calls to leaders, and those whom I called in Asia were very clear that they believed America had abandoned our traditional role as a Pacific power and wondered whether the Obama administration would reassert our presence in Asia. In Europe, we were struggling with the negative reactions to Iraq, the war on terror, the economic collapse, but also the attitude toward Europe, old Europe versus new Europe, and a sense that somehow America no longer valued this critical relationship across the Atlantic. And there was so much bubbling below the surface. We came into office as one war in Gaza was ending, a new government in Israel being formed. We had a very serious set of decisions facing the President and the National Security Council on what to do about Afghanistan, since it appeared that the Taliban had regained momentum, and the efforts to try to create some stability that would give a stronger base for the Afghans themselves to defend themselves, govern themselves, was eroding. It was a long list. And so triage is a good description. And it required several things simultaneously as well in responding to that analysis. One, it required my presence. When the President asked me to serve as Secretary of State, he said, I'm going to have to focus the vast majority of my time and attention on the economic crisis, because as bad as it is, it could get a lot worse. And he said, yet we have to demonstrate that America is no longer going to be leading with our military. Of course we will maintain the strength of our military, but we need to demonstrate more clearly our values, and that we can form partnerships and we can mobilize for common action. And that's why I'm asking you, because I know you can get on that airplane and start traveling the world. And it was a bit of a division of labor, if you will, which I totally understood and eventually agreed to carry. And it was quite striking to me. I made that decision, which I explain in the book, to somewhat break tradition, go to Asia in February 2009, because half of that trip was just showing up, demonstrating that, yes, we had treaty alliances, we had interests, political, strategic, economic. We were no longer going to be absent, and then we worked to pivot in a very public way to send an unequivocal message that the United States would be part of Asia's future, where so much of the consequential decision-making for the world will be made. But I quickly turned around and went back to Europe in March, because I wanted to reassert our relationship. I quote this old Brownie Girl Scout song, you know, make new friends but keep the old. One is silver and the other's gold. Some of you may remember that. So I wanted it to be a real statement of our commitment to our European partners. And there was so much going on there as well, because right before President Obama took office, Gazprom, the Russian gas utility, cut off gas again. They had done it before in 2006. And it became clear to me that the Europeans were going to have to take a hard look at how dependent they wanted to be on a single source for their energy. Sounds familiar. And from that very first meeting, we began talking about what could be done to find alternatives. So it was a multitasking of the highest order to try to be present, reach out, come up with new ideas, and make clear that America's presence and leadership was going to be front and center once again, and we would be listening, not just talking. We would be looking to work multilaterally, not just unilaterally, and we would use the 3 Ds of our foreign policy, not just defense, but also diplomacy and development, to promote our values and pursue our interests and protect our security.
You know, reading the book, one of the quotes that you often have used came to mind to me, and I think I said this to you at one point, and that is Max Weber's, "Politics is the strong and slow boring of hard boards."
Yes.
And the book, what really comes through in this book is sort of the day-to-day experience of being Secretary of State is not just what's the most visible, the sexiest, most interesting even issue. There's a lot of tending to the vineyards. It's very labor intensive. There's a lot of cultivation. And you mentioned the Asia trip. You laid some important groundwork in Indonesia that later paid off in Burma.
Yes. With
some democratic reforms there and your visit with Aung San Suu Kyi. And all those little things that aren't in the newspaper that nobody even knows about that are on your schedule. And people go, why is she having a bilateral with the foreign minister of some country that we don't know where it is on the map unless we're extremely well educated. And so I think that really does come through in the book.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I wanted that to come through because one of the virtues that I think we Americans need to cultivate is patience. And that's true probably in our lives, but it's particularly true in our diplomacy because so much of what still matters in the world is based on building relationships and looking for areas where you can establish some level of trust. And one of the examples in the book, which was quite dramatic actually, is how we were able to navigate through a very difficult crisis over a blind dissident in China and not endanger the substance of the framework for the relationship we'd been building with China. When I came in, I knew from my time in the Senate that we'd had very extensive economic discussions with China about currency, about trade, and those had been carried out primarily by the Treasury Department. But there were so many strategic issues that maybe we would deal with in a one-off way, but we could see that the Chinese were much more comfortable talking about all of the concerns around the economy than they were on political or strategic issues. So one of the first things I did was to propose within the administration that we combine the economic and create the strategic dialogue that would embody all of the various individual discussions we'd had with Chinese counterparts. Tim Geithner agreed, the White House signed off on it, I presented it to the Chinese when I was there on that first trip. They responded to it, and that meant we put together teams from our government and theirs to talk about everything from sanitary hygiene standards for food and produce or safety of toys to environmental clean energy joint projects to student exchanges. We put it all out there to build a much more comprehensive connection between our two governments that I hoped would not just last for one president, but be part of building a framework into the future. And that's what we did. We had intense meetings throughout the year. Then we would have an annual strategic and economic dialogue rotating between Washington and Beijing. I spent a lot of time with my counterparts, State Councilor Dai Binghua and Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi, and we had lots of in-depth discussion. So fast forward to the night I'm home here in Washington and the phone rings and I'm told that Chen Guocheng, the blind dissident, has escaped from house arrest and he is trying to make it to the U.S. Embassy in Beijing for safety and refuge and also to be given emergency medical treatment for the foot that he injured. And the question was, would I direct our embassy staff to go out, meet him, pick him up, and bring him in? Now, by any weighing of values and interests, you can see why I call this book Hard Choices. On the one hand, we had this comprehensive relationship. We were making progress in a number of areas. Others were stalled, but we had developed very candid discussions, which in and of itself was a step forward. And I was supposed to be leaving in just a few days for the annual meeting in Beijing. And that had been the cornerstone of our efforts to develop a more strategic, deeper understanding with China. Yet, we had this man, this human rights activist, who thought to himself, I'm being unjustly imprisoned in my house. I need to escape, and where would I go? The one place in the world where he thought the values of freedom and human rights would be embodied, namely the Embassy of the United States of America. And so there was a weighing, and I had to do it in a very short period of time, and I concluded that we would go out and pick him up and take him to the embassy, because after all, at the end of the day, I believe our strongest position, our best argument for who we are as Americans and what we stand for are the values that we have stood on and exemplified and struggled to fulfill from the very beginning. It was a consequential choice. There were some who disagreed with it, who were unhappy I had made it, but I felt comfortable throughout the difficult period of negotiation that ensued, because I thought at the end of the day it was the right decision to make. Well, we were able to negotiate with the Chinese over the outcome with respect to Mr. Chen and his family. We also went ahead with the strategic and economic dialogue, and we were able to balance. But we would not, in my view, have been able to do that had we not invested the time and the patience in developing those relationships. And it is something that I'm constantly reminding my colleagues in government or elsewhere. We often, as Americans, show up with an agenda. Here's what we want to do, then we want to do that, and okay, then let's get this done, and then we're out of there. That still is not the way most people in the world behave. They want to take your measure. They want to have a meal, maybe a cup of tea, talk about other things. I remember going into a meeting with the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah, and we were in a huge meeting room. And I spent about 15 minutes talking with him and talking with the foreign minister, Prince Saud Al Faisal, about camels. And I describe it in the book because I'd driven up from the airport with the foreign minister, and we'd seen all these camels that were out in the desert as we drove by to the camp of the king, and the foreign minister was telling me how much he disliked camels. And I was saying, my goodness, that's like an Australian not liking kangaroos. I mean, that's just so hard to imagine. But we were having a bit of a banter and a back and forth, and when we got to the meeting and it was this very large formal setting, I turned to the king, I said, Your Majesty, the foreign minister says he doesn't like camels. The king says, what is wrong with him? And we start having this conversation. So when we got to the real meat of it, over lunch, where just the king and I could hear one another, and he had a huge television set in the middle of this hollow square table that was blaring away so nobody could hear what we were saying except each other, we then could get down to business because we had actually interacted as two people, not two officials in a hurry. And I try to make the point over and over in the book that we just have to invest more time. And that takes patience, and it takes people willing to do that, to build those relationships. But I don't think we can achieve our goals without that.
And by the way, the Chen story is one of the sort of cloak and dagger, life imitates art kinds of stories in the book. It's amazing when you read it. It's kind of, this can't possibly really have happened the way that it did. But I also just want to say, you've improved dramatically in your pronunciation of foreign names. I was impressed you used both names of the Chinese leaders, not just the easy one-syllable one.
Well, Lissa traveled with me often as First Lady, and as in the beginning of my time in the State Department as the head of my speechwriters at the State Department. And it is true, I have absolutely no ear for language, and it's a great regret. I took Latin when I was in high school, and I think it's helped me with my vocabulary, or at least I hope it did, because it took 4 years of effort. And then I took French when I went to Wellesley, and at the end of and we had a 2-year language requirement, and I was enjoying it. I was not good at it, but I was learning, and I loved the literature part. I kind of got it down that, you know, for writing critiques of French literature, I could say things like, love is hate is love, and the professor would say, oh, magnifique, magnifique. So when I had to go around to talk about what I would take for my junior year, and I went to see my French professor and said, well, you know, I'm thinking about this course or that course. She looks at me and goes, Mademoiselle, your talents lie elsewhere.
But she's pretty good now. Pretty good. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because there's so many other things to talk about, but given that it's been kind of a messy few days in Iraq, I just wonder if we can get your quick reaction to that.
Well, let me just back up and start where we were when President Obama took office. President Bush had established a timetable for American withdrawal in 2011, as I recall, unless the Iraqis agreed to what is called a status of forces agreement that gives the necessary protections to American soldiers. There was a great deal of work done to try to figure out with the Iraqis what, if any, follow-on American force would be necessary and accepted. They needed intelligence, they needed trainers, they needed the kind of leadership skills inculcated in the reconstituted Iraqi army after it had been dissolved in the Bush administration. Well, it came down to the fact that Maliki would not present a status of forces agreement to his parliament, and that made the decision inevitable. There was not going to be an agreement for American troops to stay, even to perform limited non-combat functions. The underlying problem, though, here is not one of military preparedness and security, although we've seen neither is present in the current conflict in Iraq. The problem is the conception of leadership and governance that Maliki brought to the job of prime ministership. He would not commit to an inclusive government. He would not share power except with a very, very small circle. He was often quick to attack, even investigate, charge with crimes those who politically disagreed with him. And as a result, the inclusive governing structure that reached out to the various elements, particularly the Sunnis in Iraq, to try to overcome, yes, very deeply felt historic differences, but necessary changes if there were to be stability in Iraq never happened. And the result of that failure at the governance level, combined with the extraordinary success of Islamist extremist groups in Syria, and in particular the one now known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, has made this latest crisis especially dangerous. You don't have a government that can inspire loyalty, even among its army, and certainly not among its disparate groups. And you have well-trained, very savvy fighters coming out of Syria, coming out of Iraq, often aided and abetted, perhaps we're learning, by former officers in the disbanded Saddam Hussein Iraqi army. And it's a recipe for a horrendous conflict. The request that Maliki is making to the president to provide support, I know, are being carefully considered, but I think that it's also imperative that Maliki be presented with a set of conditions if you are even to discuss seriously any kind of military support for the fight against the jihadists. And that's a delicate and difficult task for our government, because we certainly don't want to fight their fight, because you'd be fighting for a dysfunctional, unrepresentative, authoritarian government. And there's no reason on earth that I know of that we would ever sacrifice a single American life for that. It is a, however, serious potential crisis with broad regional and even global consequences. The capture of the Turkish diplomats, the threat to all the embassies in Baghdad, most particularly ours, the discipline of the Peshmerga, the Kurdish forces, as they both protect Kurdish areas but also advance to take over some of the cities, particularly Kirkuk, that they have always believed should be theirs. What role will Iran play? If Iran sends in Quds Force troops to assist Maliki the way that they have sent in both Quds Force advisors and Hezbollah troops to support Assad, then, boy, we are looking at a potential war in the Middle East that is going to cross borders and potentially threaten the larger region and beyond. The latest figures I've seen is that there are more than 1,000 fighters on behalf of extremist groups in Syria coming from just Europe. And with open borders, no visa restrictions, somebody who grew up in France or Germany or Britain or the Netherlands or wherever will be able to come home and will be able to travel. So this has implications far beyond, you know, what, if anything, we think we can and should do to try to stave off a total collapse of the Maliki government. I would just add one other note. If you look at where we are in the region, the conflict in Syria, which right now is still a stalemate, but Assad is controlling large parts of the country. But there are many hundreds of thousands of refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq. And you have the tensions that are pervasive throughout the region being really set on fire in Iraq right now. It could draw in other countries because of attacks or because of the decision on the part of other governments that they have to defend either the Sunnis or defend the Shia or go after the Kurds. Lots of competing interests, and it's, you know, my chapter about Syria is called a wicked problem. And now it's gotten just wickeder because of the spillover into Iraq.
On a lighter note, when I used to come back from trips overseas with you, I would often have stories for my kids that involved funny, crazy, weird things that happened, some of which you didn't know about. And in fact, my kids often said, "Mom, you need to write a book about all the things that happened that Mrs. Clinton never knew." And I said, "Well, that would sort of defeat the purpose, wouldn't it?" But I don't know if you ever knew about the purse that was left behind, and various complications and logistics were done to retrieve it from I don't know where, a suitcase that ended up in a river. I don't know how many drafts of speeches we lost. I think there were some important ones that somehow had to be recovered at the last minute. But this clearly continued during your tenure as Secretary of State, and you write about a lot of the sort of comedy. There are a lot of dark days, obviously, right. Benghazi being the most obvious, but there are a lot of funny things that happen, and I'm sure in retrospect they seem even funnier, sort of comedic moments. There was of course, there had to be a hair story, right? So there's a hair story in Bulgaria. There's a shoe coming off at an inopportune moment in France. There is a you need to floss moment when President Obama pulls you aside at a meeting and points out that you have food in your teeth. Yes. And then one of my favorites is a funny thing, and I wonder if you'll just mention this a little bit. A funny thing that happens when you're at the end of the trip and you're on the plane and everybody can finally relax, and so your staff turns on a movie. Yes. Tell us about that.
Well, first thing I would say is the choice of movie was often really low grade. And I think that's because by the end of those trips, which were very long, moving from time zone to time zone, everybody was exhausted. Nobody wanted to think. Everybody just slumped back in their chairs and voted for the most mindless entertainment that was available on our plane. But the movie about the spy.
Breach? Was it called?
Yeah, it's called Breach.
Breach, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a scene in which the actor playing the character, what was his first name? I can't remember. Robert something. Anyway, he says, we don't need any more women in pants like Hillary Clinton. And
I love that story.
And just and the whole plane just like bursts into laughter. But Liz is right, because there were all these things going on while I'm, wading through briefing books that are 3 feet high, or on the phone arguing with some foreign minister I'm about to see about something, or consoling someone who's had a terrible incident in their country. So I didn't know half of the things that were going on. But we had a lot of misadventures. Now, one, which is kind of consequential and doesn't really, it ended up being fine. But, we would also go on these trips, and we had a great press corps in the State Department. Many really experienced journalists who had covered the State Department, had been stationed overseas, and it was really a pleasure working with them, because they were always asking very substantive questions about, how does this compare with what, Secretary Powell did, or what do you think if we were to take what, Madeleine Albright said. I mean, they really knew the whole landscape. But they, too, would want to let down their hair, so to speak. So we're in Lima, Peru, and I'm trying to work. I had to go to the meeting of the Organization of American States, OAS, and I'm trying to finalize the conditions that are going to be imposed by the UN Security Council on Iran. And we'd come in with our 2-part strategy, engagement and pressure, and we knew that it wasn't enough just for the United States to be putting the pressure on. We needed to get the international community. That meant primarily convincing Russia, which I think we succeeded in doing when the President and I and then National Security Advisor Jim Jones told Medvedev and Sergei Lavrov and the National Security Advisor in a very small 3-on-3 meeting that the Iranians had built an underground facility at Fordo, and the Russians didn't know it. And I think that surprised them and made them much more amenable to going along with the Security Council. The Chinese, who needed oil and gas from everywhere, did not want to see that supply cut off. So they took a lot more convincing, and we were working and working. And the Chinese ambassador, a very able diplomat, the ambassador of the United States, was covering the OAS meeting in Lima. And I was trying to get a meeting with him to see if I could get him to sign off on the final language, because he'd been authorized to convey that back to Beijing. And he had meetings and all that. And finally, you know, we were worried we wouldn't get the meeting. So the press was having a pisco sour happy hour. And apparently, pisco sours make you very happy, especially these that were made in Lima. And so we were looking for the ambassador to try to find a time. And I went down to the bar in the hotel, and we're trading stories and chatting each other up. And, you know, I'm having a pisco sour. And, you know, pretty soon, things are looking really positive and optimistic. And then all of a sudden, one of the Foreign Service officers comes and says, Madam Secretary, the Chinese ambassador is here. I go, where? Right there. Oh, Mr. Ambassador, please come in. And I take him to a back table, and we pull out all our papers, and we're sitting there. And Mark Landler, the excellent, now he's a White House reporter for the Times, then he was covering the State Department, he just sees me sitting with this Chinese man, and we're looking at papers. He comes over bearing 2 big pisco sours. Here's one for you, Madam Secretary, and here's one for you. Oh, Ambassador, yes, here it is. But, you know, you just had to be flexible and agile and kind of sort of roll literally and figuratively with whatever was happening.
It's a great story. I want to take a question from the audience, and this is from Drusy Anderson, and she said, this is really a hardball. Did you really autograph all these books? You know what? I really did. She did. I really did. And between the time that I finished the book and it went in and it was going to printing, I had about a 3-week period, and they sent me nearly 21,000 pages. And so I started signing Hillary, Rodham, Clinton. I thought, bad idea.
This is going to take me to Labor Day. And I talked to Lissa, and I talked to some other people, and they said, you know, personalize it. Just say Hillary. I said, that I can do. So I sat in my breakfast room. I turned on the old movie channels because it was relaxing, and just sat there and signed. So yes, the ones that you are getting, they have all been personally signed by me.
You mentioned Beijing.
Beijing, yes.
Beijing, 1995, 20th anniversary this year.
That's right.
And I want to tell a quick story, and then I just want to ask you about this. So you almost didn't go.
Right.
You almost didn't go because the Chinese had arrested a naturalized citizen, saying he was an American spy. But we did end up going, and we worked really hard on the speech. And I think I've told you this once, but there was an amazing thing that happened to me personally, which was that I walked up to your cabin. It was the last night. We had gone from Washington to Hawaii. We met up with you and the president of Hawaii. Then we flew to Guam, and then we went from Guam to Beijing. And we were on the last draft of this speech that had been very closely held. And I took it up to you in the cabin. And you obviously knew the speech inside out, but we were just finalizing it. And I'll never forget this, and forgive me, this is very corny, but it was a seminal experience for me. And I gave you the speech, and you didn't really say anything for a moment, and then you said, I just want to push the envelope as far as I can on human rights and women's rights. And you went on to say, and I was so struck by that. And again, this is the corny part. I was so proud to be an American, and I was so proud to have a first lady who was going to go into what was kind of a diplomatic minefield at that point and make this assertion. And you went on to say after that women's issues, women's rights are the unfinished business of the world. And I'm just wondering, where do you think things stand now?
Well, listen, that speech, which we worked so hard on, and Madeleine Albright was with us, and she provided great feedback as we were going through the drafts, was so important to me personally because I thought the United States needed to lead on women's rights, and this was the opportunity to do so at this international conference. And it was very important to set forth an agenda. And out of the conference, despite all of the difficulties, 189 countries agreed on what was called the Platform for Action, the full participation of women and girls. And I used that both as First Lady, then as Senator, and certainly as Secretary of State, to refer to and to engage with leaders and groups, civil society all over the world, to say, your nation signed up for this. How far have you come? Then when I left the State Department, I went to work with my husband and my daughter at the Clinton Foundation, and there were a lot of the important programs that my husband had established and that Chelsea was instrumental in, and I wanted to add 3 more, and one of them was what we call the No Ceilings Full Participation Project. And what we're doing in partnership with the Gates Foundation and many other partners, the UN, is gathering all the data that we can find. I was just at the World Bank 2 weeks ago with some important announcements that the bank was making with President Jim Kim, and try to put it all together in one place where we can measure the progress we've made, but also make clear the gaps that still remain. And it's been already a very meaningful experience for me, because we still have lots of countries with laws that bar women from many professions. We still have countries where they don't even record all the girls' births because it's just not that important. We have made progress under the Millennium Development Goals on primary education, and then we just drop off dramatically with secondary and higher education. We're doing a better job of combating maternal mortality, but we still have hundreds of thousands of women die every year, and on. So what we want to be is a center piece for a robust discussion in the next year as we approach the 20th anniversary in 2015 about what we've achieved, what has worked in other countries, and how much more we have to do. And there is a divide. There are countries where laws still need to be changed, laws on the books need to be implemented, cultural and religious barriers to women's participation need to be questioned from within, on and on. And in the developed world, we also want to look at the disparities that still exist between the opportunities for women and girls versus men and boys. And a lot of those are what we could call internal barriers. And my friend Sheryl Sandberg, in her book Lean In, writes about a lot of the research, the famous research of 2 resumes exactly the same. One is labeled by Henry Brown, one is by Heidi Brown, and people are much more favorable toward Henry and raising questions about Heidi. Same information, same profile. These deep cultural, psychological, internal barriers that people have about women and girls and that women and girls have about themselves. That's a more difficult area to explore and to measure, but we're even going to try to do that, because if you look at political participation in our country, it is certainly nowhere near half. We don't have half of the corporations or corporate officers held by women, on and on. And so I think it's going to be real food for thought for both countries where there's so much work to be done to just end the oppression and the abuse and the dehumanizing of women, and other countries like our own where we've made so much progress, but we still have so much more we can do.
No question. Just flipping back for a second, you were talking about Maliki and what a frustrating leader he was, and I think I was thinking about this. You've been to 112 countries, you've traveled almost 1 million miles as secretary, not to mention as senator and first lady. And I was thinking probably the only foreign leader that you didn't meet was, at this point, has been Kim Jong-un, yes. Speaking of bad pronunciation. So the question I want to ask, but I'm actually just going to put it out there, but then we're going to go to another question because we're almost out of time, is when you look into Vladimir Putin's eyes, Do you see the soul of a man who cares deeply about his country or the soul of a KGB agent? Just asking.
Are we going to come back to that? No.
You can give us the quick answer.
Yeah, fascinating. He and I have exchanged a few verbal volleys going back the last several years. His most recent was to call me weak, but then quickly adding, weakness is probably not so bad in a woman. Yeah, me too. So when I wrote about him, what I tried to do is demonstrate, obviously, that he is a very tough person who embodies a lot of hard choices. But the real sadness, and I say that deliberately, is that his view of Russia's greatness is rooted in the past, not the future. Think about how well educated and how successful so many Russian immigrants are in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. I mean, one of the co-founders of Google. Think of what could be happening in Russia today if you had leadership that wasn't trying to extend a sphere of influence, dominate Central Asia, intimidate Central and Eastern Europe, prevent countries like Ukraine from making their own decisions, impose a view of Russian greatness that is, rooted in the past, instead of working to create a modern economy, diversify beyond oil and gas, create more opportunities for people. But that's not his goal. His goal is to, as much as possible, recreate the past. And that, to me, is yet another chapter in the missed opportunities that we've seen time and again suffered by the Russian people. I have a couple of stories in my chapter about him. I do talk about why we really did push to get the so-called reset done while Medvedev was president, and we were successful in getting those Security Council sanctions on Iran and getting a new START treaty to limit nuclear weapons between us and restart inspections and transport important materiel and troops into Afghanistan across Russia. We got business done. But when Putin made his announcement he would be president again, an odd sort of presidential campaign, if you stop and think about it. They were both standing there. I think they both had on like black leather jackets, and poor Medvedev, who really did try to expand Russia's horizon and went to Silicon Valley, saw what was possible, and Putin says, I will be president, he will be prime minister. And then they had parliamentary elections before the presidential election, and they were filled with irregularities, and I criticized the elections, but it wasn't my opinion that counted as much as the tens of thousands of Russians who filled the streets. And Putin attacked me for having caused the protests. And when I next saw him, I said, Mr. President, that's not the way it works. But he is a determined, relentless pursuer of his vision of a Russia from the past. And it is, as I said, unfortunate. And the United States and the West has to make very clear that whatever his vision is, it cannot upset the stability and order that was established in Europe, first after the Second World War, then after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's going to, again, take patience but firmness to send that message unequivocally to him. So it's a complicated situation and one that we have to watch very closely.
Well, there are a lot of stories about a lot of leaders and some who you really connected with in the book. And it's one of the most fun parts of the book, I think, to learn sort of what these people are like as real people and not just as figureheads of their countries. We are actually, I hate to say it, just about out of time, so we're going to have one last question, and I'm going to take it as an audience question, but I want to just sort of ask a little setup to it. and that is that you acquired a new title during the 4 years as secretary, which was Mother of the Bride.
That's true.
You are about to acquire another new title, Grandmother. You suffered through some difficult losses, including especially of your mother, who many of us got to know. She lived with you here in Washington at the end of her life. She was adored by your staff. I was struck at her memorial that you held, at the number of Chelsea's friends who spoke about her, your staff who spoke about her, everybody she ever came in contact, it seemed. And now, of course, you're going to be a grandmother to your daughter, and Chelsea was so close to your mother, to her grandmother. So you have a lot to weigh looking ahead, which gets to the last question, and it comes from Tyler Smith via Twitter, who says, "What do you want your legacy to be?"
For the State Department or my life?
Well, he just says, what do you want your legacy to be? So I think you can.
Oh, yeah. Well,
and I guess part of one way to think about it might be, as you look ahead, you're going to be a grandmother, and you know better than most people the world that this child will be born into.
Right.
And you have to think about your life and caring for your own grandchild, and you probably are given a little thought to caring for our collective own. So how do you balance all of that?
Well, I don't think about a legacy. I think about my life, because I've had quite an unpredictable life. And I thought a lot about that when I was writing the book. I could never, when I was growing up in Park Ridge, Illinois, have imagined what I have had the great pleasure of experiencing, the challenges and difficulties along with the extraordinary experiences and opportunities. And I think that really is at the core of what I care most about, both for my own family, my future grandchild, but also for our country. I want young people particularly to feel as though the future may not be totally clear to you, but it looks like it's full of promise for you. That you have the opportunity, because you're acquiring an education, because you're willing to work hard, to be given your definition of the American dream. And that's how I was raised. My mother, who did live with us during the last 10 years of her life, was the product of a very abusive, neglectful home. But all along her much more difficult life, her childhood, she would encounter people who showed kindness and who were part of a broader community than just the family that so let her down. And so she learned how to use her education. Even though she only graduated from high school, she was incredibly intelligent and kept taking college courses almost into her 80s. She was supported by the community and really nurtured by her belief in what this country meant. And she instilled that in me and everyone that she touched. But that meant that, you had to take individual responsibility and you had to have a good work ethic, but you were part of a community. It wasn't just either be an individual or be a member of a community, it was be an individual within a community, and then the larger community of our country. So what I hope is that my grandchild, when he or she comes into the world this fall, will have that same view of what America means and why America matters. I had such a perspective from outside for those 4 years. I saw us, once again, using our innovation and our energy and our resilience to come back from a terrible economic crisis that is still not fully resolved. But I also saw so much disagreement and argument about what we were doing and what we stood for and what were the right decisions. And one particular moment that I write about in the book happened to me when I was in Hong Kong in July of 2011. It was during the first serious effort by some in the Congress to default on our debts. And I had a pre-existing speech, and there were all these Asian business leaders there, and they stood in line to say to me, what's happening in Washington? What is going to go on there? I mean, is the United States really going to default on its debts? And I said, oh, no, of course not. You know, we'll figure it out. We'll work our way through the politics of it, and had my fingers crossed behind my back. But what I noticed on that first occasion was bewilderment, confusion. Like, how can a great country do this to itself? I mean, this is not about future spending. This is about paying debts that they've already voted for, whether they agreed with it or not. It was voted for. Fast forward to last fall, and we had the government shutdown that prevented the president from going to an important meeting in Asia, where the president of China, President Putin of Russia, they were there, and the United States was absent. And once again, talking seriously about defaulting on the debt. I asked my team to give me the news coverage about what people were saying around the world, particularly in Asia, and not exclusively, Europe, Latin America. And it was no longer bewilderment, it was contempt. It was, how can you trust the Americans? They can't even run a government anymore. One Chinese official said, it's time to de-Americanize the world. Let's move toward a different reserve currency beside the dollar. Those are consequential assessments of us, because we cannot be strong abroad if we are not strong at home. We cannot continue to try to argue for and implement a rules-based order in the global economy where people have to play by those rules and where there are measures of accountability if they don't, if we can't demonstrate that our economy is working for everybody. So the book is about my time as Secretary of State, but I carried with me all of my life experiences. So I'm not ready to stop and think about legacy, because I want to keep thinking about what my life has meant to me and what my obligations are to my grandchild and everyone else. And I'm going to do that through the work at the Clinton Foundation and in other ways. But it is... I will hasten to add, it is a question and a responsibility for all of us.
And a hard choice, and a very hard choice.
And it is a very hard choice, but I think all of us have some hard choices about what kind of citizens we're going to be, what we're going to ask of our leaders, but also what we're going to ask of ourselves. And what has always made us strong as Americans goes back to that incredibly astute observation of de Tocqueville when he came and wandered around trying to understand what this country was about. And he looked at how we organized ourselves and our new democracy and the institutions we were building. He said it came down to the habits of our hearts. And I think we've got to ask ourselves what it means today to be an American in the 21st century, and what we expect from each other, what we expect from our government, what we expect from our businesses, our academic institutions, because I am more optimistic and confident about what our potential is, but I know we have some hard choices to make to try to realize that. So thank you.
This is great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I'm sorry we don't have more time.
Oh, thank you all very much.